having recently done a video on Rogue Squadron, let's continue on this Factor 5 note by talking about
Turrican!
But what do I do? Last year I did a video on the core 5 games done by Factor 5 and the recent collections that we've seen in the past couple of years. However, there's more to this series than Factor 5's versions of Turrican 1 and 2, as well as their 3 sequels to those games. Quite a lot more, actually. So I figured we're going to do basically everything else. Let's start off with the Commodore 64 versions, which are actually the original versions. There are some pretty notable differences here from the more well-known Amiga versions. Turrican 1 is mostly the same, though it has little music and a good chunk of it is completely different. There's even an extra boss in the first jetpack level. Turrican 2 is where things get more interesting. To start, there is no Chris Hulsbeck music present here at all, instead opting for a new score composed by Marcus Seibold. It may not be as beloved as the Amiga music, but it's also really good in its own right. There are also far more level design differences, and things tend to be far flashier and more frenetic, which is probably the exact opposite of what you were expecting going in. Like, look at this boss introduction. Needless to say, this is considered to be one of the most impressive games ever on the Commodore 64, and rightfully so, because it's really quite jaw-dropping. More curiously, there are also versions of Turrican 1 and 2, not only on the Amstrad CPC, but also the ZX Spectrum. The latter of which is especially impressive given the hardware. Scrolling wasn't the Speccy's forte, so to have a game based on scrolling in all directions is quite outside what the hardware should be capable of, and well, here's Turrican. It's choppy and sluggish, so it's not the most ideal way to play the game, but it's impressive that it exists at all, and the color management is quite remarkable too. The Spectrum had a very limited color palette and also had issues with color clash. Basically, if 2 sprites of different colors occupied the same space, things could get messy. So a lot of games were monochrome. Not this though. This is really well done. The Amstrad version is also very close to the Spectrum version, just with nicer graphics. Man, I also just really like the chunky look of Amstrad games. The low resolution mixed with the higher color palette is really charming. However, it's still sluggish. It's not as impressive as the Spectrum version, nor as fun or playable as the Commodore 64, Amiga, and ST versions. Turrican 2 on the Spectrum is comparatively underwhelming. It's very prone to color clash and is just not very fun to play. The Amstrad version is better, but the window is extremely tiny, which isn't exactly ideal for an exploration-driven platformer. The rendition of the desert rocks on the title screen is nice in both versions, but otherwise I would avoid these versions of Turrican 2. There was also a weird comic based on Turrican 1 in Amstrad User Magazine. I know this is a tangent, but when else am I going to be able to talk about this? It's mostly an adaptation of what you'll see in the game, but the main character isn't called Bren McGuire or even Turrican. He's Mr. T. I sure love it when a plan comes together. Next, we have Super Turrican for the NES. Wait, what? This is a different game from the more famous Super Nintendo classic. This is a PAL-only game for the NES made entirely by series creator Manfred Trenz on his lonesome. Graphics, programming, sound effects, music conversion, everything. This is more of a loose remix of the first 2 games, incorporating elements and stage themes from those games, but also deviates from them a fair bit. It also uses music from the Amiga games along with some of Marcus Seibold's music from Enforcer, another Manfred Trenz game, and one of the hardest games I've ever played. Unfortunately, Super Turrican for the NES ended up being quite compromised in development. Most of the big NES games you can think of use Memory Management Controller Chips, or MMCs. These allow games to extend the capabilities of the NES hardware. Games like Metroid, Contra, The Legend of Zelda, Mega Man 2, Super Mario Bros. 2 and 3 all use memory management controller chips. Unfortunately, Manfred Trenz couldn't use MMC chips in this game, so it was never able to live up to what he set out to accomplish. Right off the bat, there are a couple of annoying quirks because of this, most notably, the lack of checkpoints. While stages are typically smaller here, the game ramps the difficulty way up. This game is hard, like, really hard. So this might be a very aggravating barrier of entry. Otherwise, it's a really impressive effort given how this was done without an MMC chip, and with only one person doing absolutely everything. I've heard others call this one of the best Western developed games on the NES, which, yeah, while the bar is set pretty low there, is one that this game comfortably meets. I would not by any means recommend this to newcomers, but if you're already used to Turrican, it's worth giving a shot. It's just a shame that Turrican, despite being such a good game, was very much limited to the home computers that were mostly popular in Europe. Now, if only it was on consoles so us North Americans could enjoy it. As it turns out, Turrican did make it to consoles, and did reach this side of the Atlantic. These ports were published by Accolade, who most gamers will probably recognize for Bubsy. However, that's not all they did, and these ports were not handled by the same people. These ports were developed by the Code Monkeys.
Dr. Freckles, you are the best cat doctor ever! What else should I do?
Suck my
No relation. They were a UK-based developer who largely did port work in their early years. Their later catalog is interesting. They made Shrek Treasure Hunt, Simpson Skateboarding, and they also worked with a company called Phoenix Games to bring us the programming and minigames for such games as Dalmatians 3 and Dinosaurs. However, to be fair, at this point in their history, they were doing ports of Asteroids and Missile Command for the Game Boy. So, let's start with Turrican on the Game Boy. Presentation admittedly could be better. The graphics are fine for the most part, though the main sprite looks a little off. The sound, on the other hand, is extremely basic, and the music, while not ear-grating, doesn't feel that well converted. That said, this is a pretty intact port. It's missing a good chunk of the soundtrack, and the third world is missing, but otherwise, this is Turrican. It plays like Turrican, the levels are just as big, all the secrets are there. This is honestly not a bad way to play the game. The TurboGrafx 16 version is very much like the Game Boy game, but with graphics obviously closer to the Amiga version. The music has all the intervals in the right places, though I think it's playing in a different pitch and the instruments sound really grating. Then we have the Genesis and Mega Drive version. Oh boy. Graphically, it's the closest to the Amiga version, albeit with a more washed out color palette. Unlike the prior versions, all of the levels are here and all of the songs are here. However, the instruments sound awful a lot of the time. The collision detection is also less kind, making it harder to get through certain platforming sections or through some hazards. Also, the health meter drains way faster than normal. Plus, there are more enemies. Also, at least running on an NTSC Genesis as opposed to a PAL Mega Drive, it runs faster to boot. This is the most cruel and unfair way to play through an already difficult game. So, I guess if you've played Turrican so much you find it easy and want more of a challenge, here's hard mode, I guess. Next up is Earth Defender for the Watara Supervision. I don't actually have Supervision. What? Did you think that I would get a random handheld just for the sake of one joke? Have you seen the retro market lately? I know this looks like Atomic Runner, but with shooting zeros and a broken gravity-defying jump, but I'm telling you, it's Turrican. Look, there he is! It's Mr. T! So yes, going into unlicensed territory is very funny. However, what about the other way around? What if Turrican was taken and warped into something else? Even better, what if it was already an existing property? That would just be so wacky! What do you mean that's oddly specific?
In fact, We've got our own application process for becoming an officially licensed, unlicensed seller.
Universal Soldier was a 1992 film directed by Roland Emmerich. It's about a soldier in the Vietnam War, played by Jean-Claude Van Damme, who sees a fellow soldier played by Dolph Lundgren committing war crimes. They are both killed, and their corpses are used by an agency to create perfect soldiers. In the process, their memories are wiped and autonomy compromised. But traces of memories lie within Van Damme as he rebels and tries to find a sense of autonomy. I haven't watched the film in ages, but from what I remember, it wasn't very good.
It's not supposed to be there.
So what does this subpar action film taking place on Earth have to do with an all-time classic game taking place on an alien world? Accolade returned to port Turrican 2 to consoles, but then called on the Code Monkeys.
Unfortunately, the only way to usurp your power is to kill you and wear your skin as a cape. Let it begin!
No relation, to reskin it and make it based on Universal Soldier. Despite this, many elements remain the same. The level themes, designs, enemies, and even the ability to turn into the gyroscope are all retained here, no matter how absurd it feels in context of the film. Other than the main character sprite, which I have to commend on some level, as the sprites facing left and right are different due to the asymmetric design of the character. The main differences are how the bosses look. Instead of a robot head that shoots things at you, it's a giant truck. Instead of a gripping robot, it's a few helicopters. And most amusingly, varyingly giant versions of Dolph Lundgren. The flight stages are also cut out completely, instead opting for new platforming stages ostensibly based on locations from the film. Not only do these feel predictably out of place in terms of the theming, the level design is nowhere near as tight or well thought out as those found in Turrican 2 proper. They feel aimless and poorly thought out. There's also this really annoying platforming section in the fortress level where you don't have comfortable height clearance. These levels just aren't very good. And not only do they replace the far better spaceship stages, but they completely mess with the level progression and flow from the original game. However, and I am far from the first person to make this observation, but when the game is just trying to be Turrican 2, it does a good job. A lot of the shortcomings from the prior Accolade ports are resolved here. The soundtrack both on Genesis and Game Boy is far better translated, and the Game Boy version also has a track for every level, not just one per world. On Genesis, the health bar no longer drains absurdly quickly. While the Genesis version of Turrican 1 was made unfairly difficult, this is noticeably easier than the original version of Turrican 2. While I can complain about that to some degree due to my affinity towards the original, I'd rather have that over it just being unfair. I really have to commend the Code Monkeys for improving their craft so much here. It's just a shame that it was undermined by the baffling decision to make this based on Universal Soldier. However, there's one more version. Not on the TurboGrafx-16 this time, but instead on the Super Nintendo. This version was never released. There's an Unseen64 article on it that frankly comes across as way too opinionated and presents the narrative that it didn't come out due to it being unlicensed. While it did see unofficial releases on bootleg and reproduction cartridges after the fact, this is obviously not why it was cancelled. In the comment section, the coder for this version states that it was 2 months behind the other versions due to waiting for the development kits. However, by the time the port was finished, Accolade pulled the plug on releasing it since the other versions were out and their performance was made clear, in a beautiful twist of irony. Making the game a licensed tie-in to boost sales resulted in poor sales, and they realized that it would have done better if they just released it as Turrican 2. What an epic tragedy! Like a king sitting atop a throne of the ashes of his subjects. That is a far better story than "the game poo-poo so Nintendo likey." I don't say this to diss Unseen64. It's a fantastic resource with a lot of good information. Instead, I think the folly lies on the person who wrote this article. They should be ashamed of themselves for spreading misinformation online. You hear that, Edward Morley? Fuck! Yeah, that was me. For I was but a dumb teenager who believed things far too quickly and with not enough evidence to support it. So guys at Unseen64, please feel free to change or remove it. In many ways, it is quite visibly out of date. However, let's look at the ROM itself. This is not the finished product, and it shows. It's beatable, but quite rough, and the presentation is quite awful. That should be expected to some degree, as a lot was probably placeholder assets, but the key thing to take away here is the sound. If you wanted to hear one of the best video game soundtracks of all time, twisted and warped into a mangled mess of screeching tones and piercing pitches, go ahead. Your friends will love you. Up next is Rendering Ranger R2 for the Super Famicom. This was another game developed by Manfred Trenz, but this time it only had a limited release in Japan and is notoriously rare. It's a shame too, because this is an excellent game for the system. For one, the technical skill on display here cannot be overstated. The Super Nintendo had a rough time with slowdown and action-heavy games like this, especially when there's a lot on screen. However, not only is there a frankly absurd number of objects on screen at once, not only is the game jaw-droppingly beautiful, but this game does not slow down. Ever. Despite not being called Turrican, there are a lot of Turrican elements here. There are run and gun sections and flight sections. Many of the bosses from the prior games make a return, especially in Stage 8. It has walkers that you jump on, and at the start of the second stage, you can see the ship you swing on in Super Turrican 2 crash land in the background. Speaking of Super Turrican 2, that's the game that this bears the most resemblance to, as it's quite linear and has a similar dreary atmosphere. Though honestly, I have more fun with this one. That said, this game is notoriously punishing. I've heard from people who had a really hard time getting past the first level, though honestly I find the difficulty in the opening stages to be pretty manageable. However, the last few stages, 7 and 8 in particular, are absolutely hellish. Make no mistake, this game will absolutely hand your ass to you. But even with that said, if you want a challenging run and gun with some really damn good shmup sections, absolutely play this game. Out of all the games or versions of games we've talked about here, this is the key game that I would wholeheartedly recommend. We've covered the best, so I guess it's time to cover the worst. After 1995, the Turrican series entered a pretty long slump. The rights became convoluted and it became harder to get new games off the ground. Around this time, Rainbow Arts was purchased by THQ. Both Factor 5 and Manfred Trenz tried to bring Turrican into 3D, with Factor 5 working on Turrican 64, which would later be renamed to Tornado, and Trenz working on the aptly named Turrican 3D. However, Trenz became frustrated by THQ canceling the game, stating that the game would never come out. Other than that cancelled game, THQ kinda just sat on the IP, not doing anything with it. That is until 2004, almost a decade later. At that point, a new Turrican game was finally coming out, simply named Turrican. Simply put, it was a reboot. Would this be on PC, PS2, Xbox, GameCube? No, it would be released on something even better. Turrican 2004 was released as a built-in game on the Siemens M65 phone, and the game didn't appear on other cell phones of the time. Granted, it is a Java game, but one that is very tailored specifically around the resolution and CPU speed of the M65, so running it on other phones may prove to be quite the pain. As such, it can also be a pain to emulate too. Given this is probably the most obscure Turrican game, and is definitely the hardest to actually play for yourself. What? Did you think that'd be crazy enough to get a specific European handheld from the mid-2000s just for the sake of playing this one game? Because you'd be right. What is wrong with me? Right off the bat, the game uses sprites from the 1995 DOS version of Turrican 2, mixed with some sprites from the Amiga games for bosses alongside some original sprites and tile sets too. The old assets had to be scaled down in order to fit on the tiny 132 by 176 pixel screen. I was expecting this to clash more, but it actually feels more unified than I was expecting to. I honestly quite like a lot of the backgrounds, and the game is pleasingly colorful. What isn't so pleasing is basically everything else. This game is modeled after the first two Turrican games, with labyrinthine levels to explore. However, this is a very bad fit for these early phones. The screen crunch is a huge issue, not just because of the tiny resolution, but also the aspect ratio itself. To mitigate this, the camera shifts so your Turrican trainee is on the opposite side of the screen to the direction in which you are moving. The issue is, in a game where you'll be going back and forth a lot, this results in the controls feeling extremely twitchy. There are new gameplay elements like switches to activate doors or destroy barriers. You also have new jetpack stage types where instead of being vertical flight stages, there's standard platforming stages where your jump is replaced with thrust controls. These are interesting ideas, sure, however they're either lost or undermined in execution. The game is structured very poorly, and this works against the rest of the game. You start each level with 5 lives. I could understand this on some level given the game is meant for small doses to accommodate being on a phone. However, this doesn't just apply to if you lose lives, the counter resets to 5 even if you gain them. Therefore, while 1-ups are in this game, it is pointless to hunt for them. Oh, but you at least have gems to collect, right? Wrong. There are no gems in this game. So outside of the select moments where you're required to, it is pointless to explore in this exploration-driven platformer. The jetpack stages are also a nightmare. For one, it's just not very fun to platform around with. It's floaty and slow while also trivializing a lot of the level design instead of working with it. Then, despite the vertical aspect ratio, you have the screen crunch at its absolute worst. It's way too easy to completely lose sense of what's below you, or just inadvertently fly into a hazard above you. Then there are these sections where you have to balance between the two, and the camera just makes this awful. However, even if the game was structured better or had a wider field of view, it still wouldn't save this atrocious level design. These stages feel extremely aimless. You end up just kinda meandering around until the level just abruptly stops. There's way too many long stretches where it's just a flat ground with no platforming in sight, and when there is platforming, it's terrible. In this kind of platformer, leaps of faith are going to be a factor. However, leaps of faith need not be a bad thing in of itself. The distinction, of course, comes from whether or not the games in question instill that trust. Leaping into the emptiness below you is going to be a lot more comfortable if you're confident that there's ground beneath you to land on. This game, on the other hand, fucks that up so bad, it's actually kind of incredible. Not only am I constantly uncomfortable jumping off platforms, I'm also afraid to even walk around. Most of my deaths in the game have either come from colliding into hazards the second they appear, or from really cheap enemy behavior. Oh, but at least the soundtrack is good, right? No, it's not. Doesn't sound so bad at first, but this is the only song in the game. It's short, repetitive, and it gets really tiring after a while. Look, there's also multiplayer. Wow, a series first. Unfortunately, it's just a couple of half-baked mini-games where you hot potato the phone back and forth. It's kind of a blessing that this is the most obscure and hard-to-play entry in the Turrican series, because it's easily the worst. There are some neat, or at the very least interesting ideas here, but none of them work out. Say what you will about these early cell phone games, but Turrican is just not a good fit for that format. So, of course, THQ tried it again. Here we have Turrican 2005. This was made available on more phones, and while having many of the same traits as Turrican 2004, this is a new game. This game is slightly better. Granted, it's also been stripped down a lot. There's no story, the Academy and Industrial Moon worlds are missing, and a new space world has been added. Each world starts and ends with a shmup section with you landing on and taking off from each planet, which is a pretty cool idea. The other stages in between are standard Turrican platforming sections. Though while there are no levels dedicated to the jetpack, the levels have specific regions where the jetpack is activated. While I'm grateful that there's less jetpack at once, when and where it's used feels more random. It also doesn't help that it's still not fun, and it's not great when you're stuck on thin platforms while flies clip through walls to gang up on you and kill you. In each stage, you start with 3 lives. There are no 1-ups to hunt for, but there are gems in each stage. That's right, a grand total of 3. While the stages feel more thoughtfully laid out, have more platforming and more of a reason to explore, it's not a lot, and the levels end up feeling bloated with how little there is to find in them. You can jump on walkers this time, thank God. The game runs smoother and feels better to play. There's a boss theme, so the soundtrack isn't just one MIDI playing relentlessly. The graphics are nicer, and this is also the first Turrican game to feature a map system, beating Turrican Anthology by a good 17 years. That said, enemy placement and behavior seems really glitchy this time around, with really random respawn and erratic behavior. I swear, the flies have never been worse to deal with than in this game. But overall, while this feels stripped down in comparison to Turrican 2004, it does feel more refined. I'd hesitate to call it good or even worth playing, but it is an improvement, and that's something at least. These games have some nice environments and interesting ideas. I do feel you could make a good game out of them. However, they're just not good, and part of that is, unfortunately, the decision of making this kind of game for this kind of device. The vertical aspect ratio, the limited controls not optimized for gaming, and the lack of resolution on the M65 does not lend itself to an exploration-heavy action platformer, but that didn't stop others from trying unofficially. Johnny Rumble is quite blatantly a Turrican clone, and another attempt to bring this kind of game to a Java phone. It's a solid effort, but the screen crunch is still rather annoying. Thankfully, we have Johnny Rumble 2. This uses far more compact sprites in relation to the rest of the screen, and out of all these Turrican Java games or clones, this is the most playable and by far the best. But what about the weirdest? So earlier I mentioned the DOS port of Turrican 2 in 1995 developed by Sun Project. It's very faithful to the Amiga game, but with the assets completely redrawn. Unfortunately, this does result in some very slight level design changes in places that make certain jumps far more annoying, but overall there's far more color depth at 256 colors. The art style is divisive, but I think it looks nice on its own merits. There was going to be a similar DOS port of Turrican 3, and there were promotions made for it, but ultimately this never materialized past very few sprites surfacing online, which made it so weird when I saw this. These are very clearly redrawn Turrican 3 assets with greater color depth that are notably different from the Mega Turrican versions. In fact, stylistically, it is very reminiscent of Sun Project's work on Turrican 2, but if they did Turrican 3. That main character sprite is a dead giveaway. So there are a few possibilities here. 1. Someone who worked at Sun Project was connected to people who worked on Apocalypse 3000 and provided them with the assets from the cancelled DOS port. 2. The people at Oyam recreated Turrican 3's assets perfectly in the style of Sun Project independently. Or 3. The people at Oyam found the sprites from the cancelled DOS port somewhere and decided to make a quick mobile platform shooter with them. I personally find the last one to be the most likely considering this game's bootleg nature, so I find the notion of just having bizarrely good sprite artists at hand who could mimic what a cancelled game would have looked like perfectly really hard to believe. It also doesn't help that all of the assets from Apocalypse 3000 are Turrican 3 redraws. So that makes me doubt that there were artists on the project to begin with. But ultimately, I do not know. I wish I did, but I do not know. My only source of any of this information is my eyes. So if any of you know who did it, please let me know, because this is the sort of thing that can and will drive me crazy. And given that I bought a Siemens M65 just so I could play the worst Turrican game, you know that I'm not that far off from that. But yeah, I think I hit the bottom of the Turrican iceberg and I need sleep. Good night.